Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a researcher with the Geostrategy program at the institution and your host for this episode. What we're going to be talking about in this episode, and I'm going to shortly introduce the very, very eminent guest that I have for this recording, is a bit of a conversation on the trends and patterns observable in conflicts of the times that we live in, right? And unfortunately, there are a lot of those, but there are always some of the other lessons and trends to distill from them, not just from the perspective of the armed forces and what they need to look forward to and prepare for, but also for the audience in general, which ranges from decision makers and policy specialists to readers and curious enthusiasts, right? And, if I can just take you back for a moment to February of this year, what we've seen is the US go incessantly to war with Iran. And in the process, and perhaps for the first time in recent conflicts, use and deploy at scale one-way attack drones. And their category or their family of one-way attack drones is called Lucas. The interesting detail that we can decipher from the use of the Lucas is that it's almost based or modeled off of an Iranian one-way attack drone, which is called the Shahid, right? And the Shahid 136 on the Iranian side was also deployed massively to not just target countries and military objects across the strait in Oman or in Bahrain, right? But also 17,000 kilometers away in Cyprus, the RAF base in Cyprus in particular, right? What this essentially tells me is that $20,000 to $35,000 loitering munition are proliferating. They're making precision strikes more accessible, and they're clearly speaking to a pattern, at least in my understanding, about how adaptation during conflict, not just of doctrine, but also of production capability, is outrunning peacetime acquisition, right? So you can have the largest military industrial complex in the world or a massive inventory in peacetime, or you can have fully blossoming acquisition processes, but it still might not be enough. And that's not just true of probably the US-Iran conflict, but also the conflict ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, right? Then simultaneously, you have conversations on governing military technologies. One of the most prominent ones that's been running for nearly a decade is the meeting of members of the UN group of governmental experts. They sit in Geneva, as they did in March recently, if I'm not wrong, and they debate how to characterize systems that are already flying in operational missions, right? And some of these can be categorized as what we know to be lethal autonomous weapons. So there's both the debate and the operationality, if I may say so, to talk about here. And there's so much more that can be deciphered from conflicts of today. And to give you a flavor of some of this, we have no one else better placed to make sense of this but Mr. Manoj Harjani, who is a research fellow and a coordinator of the Military Transformations Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He has spent a long, long time studying how disruptive technologies reshape militaries, are deployed by them, and how they, of course, impact both governance and competition. And interestingly, Manoj came into this work through the Singapore Public Service. So hopefully, he will give us both the flavor of how this works in terms of governance and in terms of the scholarly interpretation of operational contexts, and his papers, especially on the governance of laws and multilateralism on this front, would be something we recommend, and we will be attaching in the caption for this episode, right? So Manoj, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Anushka. That was a very kind introduction. Honestly, I think you made it sound like this world is not a very confusing and frustrating one to analyze. Most of the time, that's what it feels like. So, but very happy to be here, very happy to have this conversation.
Right.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. And I think what I'm hoping for is for you to help us untangle the threads and really lay the confusion out bare, right? We're not afraid to take that head on. And I'm sure neither are our listeners. So without further ado, let me kind of throw the floor to you and begin with a question that really speaks to first the incident of the US-Iran war in particular, and then perhaps we could zoom out as we move forward with the conversation. So at least from my understanding, the Iran war kind of informs us on both effective and ineffective uses of military and of missile, pardon me, and drone technologies. And on the latter front in particular, as I alluded to it earlier, there's the Lucas alternative, and there are US CENTCOM strategies on drone proliferation, which are matched by what the US PACOM used to be the Indo-PACOM, what they said about a hellscape strategy involving a host of drones in the Taiwan Strait as well, right? So, in your understanding, is this the defining moment for drone proliferation and in many ways for this enhanced accessibility of attrition and precision strikes, right? What do you distill from it all? Over to you.
Thanks, Anushka. Well, it's a great question because for a long time, discussion and debate around autonomy on the battlefield was largely a theoretical one. So in the last several years, we've had the unfortunate experience of seeing some of that evidence, really on display. War is reported on in a different way than it was many years ago. And I think especially the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine was something that I think really shone a spotlight on the use of autonomous systems on the battlefield. And so I feel like what you're seeing, more recently between the US and Iran is a reflection of a kind of a trend that has started long before. And not even before the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. That was, I think, maybe a real world catalyst for what had kind of been in play for some time, which was, a shift towards fewer humans on the front line, having greater precision and range through autonomous systems. All of these are trends that have been in place for a long, long time. So I think you're kind of seeing the culmination of years of defense R&D. You're seeing the culmination of years of advancements from the private sector in AI and autonomous systems. You're also seeing, I think, the rise of newer players also in the defense industry. It's no longer dominated by the same old names, and I think so that's also changed the landscape quite a bit. You have different types of companies that are now supplying military. So again, it's a lot of change on a lot of fronts, and in a way, what you see reported in the news is sort of a small slice reflecting the culmination of all of these different trends.
Right, that's really interesting. And I think a fair bit of that evolution, if I can quickly follow up, is also in American strategy, right? Because, of course, like you said, in the news cycle, a lot of the debate is around how the US, despite being the greatest military power in the world and the likes, was not able to see decisive outcomes in the Iran war. Firstly, I want to ask you if that's an assessment you agree with purely in terms of military objectives. And then secondly, if there's some sort of an evolutionary trend we are going to see in how great powers approach military domains and military tech, because usually diffusion often happens from the next trends that they kind of set up and put in place.
Well, I don't know if I'm fully qualified to make such assessments, but what I can say from the slice that I do observe is that the U.S. military and the Department of War, they've been really engaged in a very rapid process to change procurement processes, to change strategy in terms of how the different service branches and joint commands are also operationalizing the system. So there's been a lot of effort to kind of move with feedback from what is coming out on battlefields elsewhere, as well as what the US is also experiencing through its own engagements. So I think that definitely is an exciting new development. Success or failure, I think it's a little bit hard for me to say, but what I can see is that really a shift in mindset. So where before you would see, reliance on primes to deliver systems, now there's a, great willingness to engage in smaller companies, startups, companies that don't really have the defense pedigree. They're maybe more tech companies, in terms of their DNA, but then engaging in the supplying of defense systems or components or software. So I think that change has been very interesting to observe.
Right, that's a really interesting one. Some would say the Chinese have been doing it forever, right? But that's definitely, I think, where the world seems to also be moving from my perspective, sitting here in India, because now more than ever before, procurement policies want to focus on leveraging the private sector in general, but also startups, like you said, and some of these patriotic firms. And when I say something like that, the example that comes to my mind is Palantir. And so leveraging some of those firms that want to be able to contribute to national security, even if they've been operating in the commercial and civilian domain on the whole. But just to take that point and zoom out a little bit on broader trends and patterns in autonomy, yes, of course, lesser humans on the front line is reduction in human lethality in general has, like you said, been an aim for conflicts for the longest time now. But how much of this is then being outsourced to intelligentization, in your opinion? Again, intelligentization is a little bit of a Chinese word, but going from autopiloting to automation and autonomy in weapon systems, in military technologies, what kind of trends are you distilling on that front in the defense domain?
Oh, okay. So that's a big question. One thing I would say that's really worth looking at is for the more recent examples that you see around the use of AI in decision support. I think that's a very interesting area. And what do I mean by that? So essentially, decision support systems, it's a big kind of woolly term to describe a very wide variety of systems. It can be to help with targeting. It can be to help with, which resources do you select to engage a target. It can be in determining the best course of action, whether that course of action is compliant with other rules. So there are many different types of decision support systems. I think the use of AI there is quite an interesting trend to observe. Some of the examples have been a little bit controversial. So I think there was some reportage a few years ago about Israel's use of the Lavender system in Gaza. I think more recently there have been examples around the use of the Maven system in the US strikes on Iran. So I think that there's more attention on this. There's more discussion around the use of AI and autonomy in this space, particularly since the traditional idea is that, well, humans make the decisions, but even if AI is not being granted full authority over let's say what you call the kill chain, there may be very important support roles, and there may be decisions that are heavily informed by AI generated input. So I think from that perspective, it's quite interesting because you're almost witnessing a gradual change in also how decision making is occurring in and around the battlefield. So that, I think, is an area worth digging into further. That's also been the subject of a lot of the governance conversations, the conversations at the multilateral level as well.
Right. That's, again, a really interesting facet because, right, the evolution is quite visible, both in terms of operational deployment and governance conversations. So actually, this has been a subject for curiosity for me over anything else, which is the subject of lethal autonomous weapons, right? As you alluded to it already, the idea is that there are categories and there are a diverse set of roles within the broad portfolio of autonomy that AI can supplement with. And if they complete the kill chain on their own accord, it's probably lethal autonomy. If I don't know, I'm just experimenting with the term here, not knowing about its definition on the whole. So I really want to understand from you, in all of the body of work that you've been able to kind of come up with, how have you what is the best kind of definition that you have encountered on lethal autonomous weapons and their use cases and categories, to just give the lay of the land for our listeners? And then could you also chime in a little bit about what are the main governance conversations happening around looking after looking after them, and not just at the UN level, but also maybe those that involve the private sector, and any AI related conversations that have been taking place?
Okay. Well, I'll start by giving you a little bit of the landscape in terms of governance. Well, you're right. Much of the discussion is happening at UN platforms for autonomous weapons. So you mentioned the group of governmental experts. So they meet twice a year in Geneva. That's been a very important conversation for a decade now. There's also I guess not necessarily a parallel conversation, but another conversation happening at the UNGA through the first committee. There have been resolutions for the last few years on autonomous weapon systems, and also on military AI. At the most recent session, there was also an additional resolution around the risks of the AI nuclear nexus. So this is very much the UN conversation. On military AI, there's also another platform called the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summits. These have been happening since 2023, so there have been 3 held so far. The main outcome there has been consensus around key ideas and principles for governance and how to try and begin to operationalize that. So somewhere between 40 to 60 countries have, agreed and endorsed these documents over the years. The most recent document was called the Pathways to Action. And as you can tell, so the language is very suggestive, right? Like, where do you really bring the governance conversation into an operational and organizational setting for military, so that they can start to then enact some of these changes and impose some of these principles on how they are doing things and how they've been set up to procure and use and operationalize AI in the military domain. So that's a sort of a big chunk of the conversation there. You mentioned the private sector, which is very interesting. So the private sector does participate at REAIM, less so in the UN platforms, because that's not really a space that caters to the private sector specifically. It's typically state-centric. And actually, this is a point that's worth unpacking further, which is that I think the private sector is quite underrepresented in the conversation. There may be smaller dialogues and conferences where you have private sector speakers, or even workshops involving private sector players. But I think really they're quite underrepresented in the conversation because the innovation is happening there. They are the system developers, they are the system integrators, implementers. And so not really having them more involved in the governance conversation, I think is quite a challenge. But I say that, and I'm making it sound like it's very easy to involve them. It's not. So I think that's also why they've not been involved in a very significant way. You do see some very interesting efforts, for example, by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. They're working on some guidelines to kind of frame responsible behavior for the private sector in terms of military AI. There's work by SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, on how do you do responsible procurement. So I think these are really great examples of research being done out there to inform how can the private sector be involved in a meaningful way. For our program at RSIS, we've just completed some research on testing and evaluation of military AI systems. So again, because this is an area where the private sector is heavily involved, and governance really depends on your ability to test and understand these military AI systems. So all of these are kind of, I would say, little contributions to trying to broaden the discussion to see how the private sector can be better involved.
Right. It's fascinating you brought up testing and evaluation. I think that's something, again, that's been around as part of conversations, especially on laws. Because if I'm not wrong, there's an Article 36 requirement to test certain military AI capabilities or any military capabilities in general before operationalization. But right, because they are the developers, the testers, and evaluators, the private sector is the they here. It kind of seems like it's important to have them on board, right? And there are other examples outside of the military technologies domain where private sector and multilateral participation remains prominent, right? The Paris call for trust in cyberspace, for example, which may not have a lot of government signatories across the world, but it definitely has a lot of telecom companies and industry actors and unions that have signed on, right? And again, it's a non-binding instrument, but it sets out, if I can borrow the re-aim phrase, pathways for action. So just on that front, I really wanted to understand if the conversations on testing and evaluation at the global level, especially through means like Article 36, but also through other aspects of what the best practices so far in testing and procurement have been. You talked about the CIPRI procurement guidelines, right? So how have those shaped up? What at the multilateral level do countries agree on when it comes to what the best means of operationalizing these are, notwithstanding the fact that they've already been used in conflict at some points?
Well, that's a great question. I think the main challenge right now is that the conversation's still quite an early stage. So there are a lot of good ideas being put forward by, think tanks, advocacy groups, and states. So everyone is kind of really getting very involved in sharing and workshopping these ideas, which I think is fantastic. There's nothing legally binding yet, I'm afraid. So I think that's also one of the big challenges, right? So, and it's also a source of debate because some will argue, well, do you need to have the very formalized step of a legally binding agreement in order to push forward on some of these governance best practices, or even to encourage the development of certain norms around the use, for example, of military AI or autonomous weapons. So I think that's also part of the debate. Um, well, I'll say this. I think the debate on autonomous weapons happening in Geneva, it's very much focused on IHL, the International Humanitarian Law, the law of armed conflict. And so the ability to then reflect some of the technical aspects of the conversation is a little bit limited because that's a platform that's really focusing on the IHL aspects. But I think having then that space to further discuss, what are the technical issues, and where can the private sector then also be more involved, I think will be a conversation that will happen, but it doesn't necessarily happen. This is not the right platform for that, if I can say that. I think this is also why you see the technical details getting discussed in more focused workshops and conferences and things like that. But then again, it's very hard to trace a clear line from these types of engagements between states, private sector, and academia or think tanks. It's very hard to trace a line from that then straight to, oh, well, country X changed their policy for this reason. It's really, really hard to trace that. But what I would say is that because there's so much effort being put in to, discuss and to kind of think through these ideas, you do see a lot of states paying attention to that. So this also means that what states do nationally is also very important because they are in a position to release more detailed, whether it's national strategies or guideline documents or procurement policies for defense or defense industrial strategy. So it's not just about what's being discussed multilaterally, in Geneva or in New York or wherever, but also nationally, what are countries doing? And then there's another intervening layer, which is the regional layer. So in the part of the world that I'm based in Singapore, the ASEAN layer is very important. And so what is being done at that level will also then have an impact. So, nationally, regionally, and then, multilaterally, you've got many layers to kind of work with. So I don't think governance only happens at the UN, right? So I think there are really a lot of opportunities and platforms where these ideas can shape the behavior and practices of states. The only question is, well, what kind of standard are you working with, right? If you're expecting a legally binding instrument, then yeah, you've really got to look at the multilateral platforms. If you're looking for, well, how do you change practices among a group of states or even individual states, then you've got to look at the regional and national level, I think.
Right. I have a bunch of small questions, and maybe we could come to that towards the end if we have more time. But one thing that I would really want to unpack here is what you've talked about, which is national defense industrial strategies and the case of Singapore. I think, again, that's an interesting one, and everyone's always trying to figure out Singapore's leanings, its approach to developing its armed forces, even as we acknowledge that that isn't potentially what Singapore is known for, right? And yet I am sure the potential and the modernization trajectory is already there. And we're hoping you could enlighten us a little bit on what is Singapore drawing in terms of lessons from these contemporary conflicts and these debates on governance or the involvement of the private sector, and where is the trajectory of its defense industrial strategy going, especially in the military technologies domain.
Okay, I think a couple of interesting observations there. So definitely Singapore is no exception, like many other militaries across, globally, right? They've been closely observing all of the different conflicts in different parts of the world and trying to, glean, are there any lessons, for whatever, domestic changes or transformation that is ongoing. And so just to give you an example, so there was an announcement regarding, recruits going through basic military training in Singapore, being given the opportunity to learn how to, pilot and operate, one of the small off-the-shelf drones. So I think changes like that are small signals that suggest that, hey, there are lessons being taken away from different conflicts. And then this is then reflected in how the training is being changed, the accompanying, equipping for soldiers is being changed, and so on. So that's one example. You also see Singapore pursuing, various defense cooperation agreements with various countries. Many of those have a tech element to it. For example, earlier this year in February, Singapore renewed an agreement with South Korea on chemical and biological defense. So it's an information sharing agreement. And so agreements like that then further defense industrial cooperation on these areas. I think there's also part of the sort of overall upgrading of ties between the two countries. There's, a commitment to do more joint defense R&D and even, work towards an agreement on joint production in some areas. So I think Singapore has been kind of very steadily pursuing, defense diplomacy, defense cooperation that has a tech and a defense industrial element to it. I think one other observation is also that, if you see the systems that the Singapore Armed Forces has announced publicly, it's very clear that it's also a reflection of, Singapore's changing demographics, heavily aging society. There's just a much smaller pool available to basically to man all of these systems. And so the newer systems, they require less manpower. There's, an emphasis on using technology as a multiplier. And I think that's been an, long ongoing part of the Singapore Armed Forces transformation. So it might seem mundane to bring it up, because, demographics is, but in Singapore, it's a very important factor, right? So we are a very small country, a super aging population. So this naturally then affects things like national service, the pool of available manpower for, the military, how you want to structure your systems and the procurement of future systems then will depend on all of these factors. Because I think procurement for defense it's not a 3 or 5 year affair. It's really a 10 or 20 year affair. And so they've really got to take into account so much change and in a way put the armed forces on a foundation that it's able to safely buy these systems and operationalize them, because buying is just the first step. You need to then get your people trained. You need to, test it out, go for exercises. So it really takes a long time between acquiring a new bit of technology and then finally seeing the capabilities change. And so this is also why, this might be an unrelated point, but this is also why I'm a little more cautious in, saying that, well, AI is going to transform militaries and autonomous weapons are going to transform militaries, because I think there's this big gap between actually acquiring the technology and then deploying it. And then you do see some evidence that, it's really not straightforward. And I think militaries are really trying to figure out, well, how do you operationalize these systems effectively? And then what does it mean, for things like training or doctrine or procurement or, there's so many factors that really go into thinking about this. Again, these complexities don't really feature very prominently in the governance debate. So I think that's also why it's important to have the, many layers of conversation and the many different platforms that I mentioned, because you really do need a wide range of spaces to be able to kind of talk and figure out what are the best practices.
Right. That's really well put. And I think the Indian defense ecosystem empathizes with the idea of how long the trajectory it can be between issuing the acceptance of necessity and eventually seeing that capability perform on the stage and get operationalized to the point that it is ingrained within the armed forces, right? And I feel like even within the structure of the armed forces, there would be differentiations in the cultures of infantry, artillery, Navy, and the Air Force. And then that adds an additional layer of complexity, even if drones are useful to all of them equally, right? And in different ways. So that's something, again, India and many militaries around the world are no stranger to. And the boat is in that sense the same. But I just had, two quick follow-up questions to bring this conversation to a well-rounded close. And they again pertain to something that you've talked about already, which is, one is the question of the ASEAN layer in the discussion on military technologies, right? That was really interesting that you brought it up, because I think, again, that's a perspective that we don't often get to hear in India, on how there can be a regional layer to normative or even operational conversations on the deployment of military technologies. And I think many analysts around the world were looking at the border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia in 2025. And for me personally, the interesting thing was how Chinese tanks performed when they were used by the Royal Thai Army. But even beyond that, are some of those conversations kind of commonplace to parse out at fora offered by the ASEAN? And how does that regional layer broadly play out in your understanding? And the second part of this, and that will be my final question, I swear, was about the pathways to action that you talked about. Because you've been following the ReAIM Summit for 3 years now, and you understand how it works, are any of these pathways to action actionable in your understanding? Over to you.
Thanks, Anushka. Really, it's no easy questions here. So, okay, so on ASEAN, very interesting. So, last year at the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, this is an annual meeting that takes place. There was a joint statement on AI in defense in the military domain. So that's a good sign, because it means that, thinking about the governance of, military AI is on the agenda. The Southeast Asian countries are thinking about it. So I think all eyes will be on the upcoming ADMM for this year to see whether there will be, a follow up to that. So the thing about ASEAN is that, you've got to, I think, there's often a lot of unreasonable expectations placed on it as an organization. It was originally set up as a conflict prevention mechanism. I think with some exceptions, it's done a pretty good job. There's the region has been largely peaceful and stable. So then when you expect it to, automatically solve issues like AI governance, military AI governance, it's more complicated. But I think in terms of setting up, institutional platforms for discussion, working towards voluntary guidelines, I think ASEAN has been great on that front for civilian AI. So I think from my perspective, I'm looking to see, will the same happen for military AI. And so I think, so that's why this upcoming defense ministers meeting will be quite important. Now, on to your second question, which was on ReAIM. So So Kenya has announced that it will host the next REAM summit in April 2027. So that's great news because what happened with the third REAM summit was that it was supposed to happen in 2025, but then there was a delay in announcing the host. There was a delay in the event. So it only happened in February of this year. So that broke the annual cadence, which was a little bit unfortunate. And you also kind of see that it was unfortunate because then more rushed preparation meant that fewer countries signed on to the Pathways to Action document. And so there was a lot of concern like, oh, is REAM losing its steam? I personally don't think so. I think it's a very valuable platform. As host, Kenya will have a big task on its hands because now the ecosystem discussing multilateral military AI governance has grown. It's not just REAM. There are I mentioned the discussions at the UN General Assembly's first committee. So there have been resolutions tabled over the last few years. The resolution that was adopted at the end of last year led to a series of informal exchanges in Geneva that took place just last month. So I think REAM has to figure out where does it stand relative to all these other conversations that are taking place, including the discussion on autonomous weapons, because some part of that discussion deals with the AI-enabled autonomous weapons. So it all gets very confusing and overlapping. So I think there's a role for Kenya to play in terms of sort of disentangling some of that. I think the other part will be, should they produce another outcome document? I'm not personally convinced that that's the best way. Then it just becomes a very standard thing. Okay, we'll meet every year, we'll produce a document. I think there are other avenues to explore, working groups, finding ways to work with the private sector, maybe on standards. There are all sorts of other options, I think, that can be explored through REAM, which not to say that it hasn't tried to. So I think REAM, it's really, the conversations have been quite broad and wide ranging, but I think there's opportunities to zero in on specific opportunities. So, I think, yes, not easy to host a major multilateral event like this. So kind of really looking forward to seeing what will happen at the next summit there. Maybe just one last thing to add is that all of this doesn't preclude the possibility of new platforms emerging. I think states are generally quite cautious and conservative because they very well aware of the resources involved to set up a new, you can't just set up a new multilateral platform overnight. It's very expensive. It's a huge commitment. And so, not to say that I think there will be this big blossoming of different organizations and platforms, but I think we shouldn't rule out the possibility that there could be, different or new platforms to kind of discuss some of these governance issues. So that will also, I think, be an interesting area to look out for in the years ahead.
Right. Thank you so very much for that, Manoj. I think my biggest takeaway from all the threads that you've unpacked here is just the sheer importance, even to this date, right from after 1648, of national decision-making and governmental authority in a lot of these aspects. Even when it comes to governance, I often think about it, especially in the cyber domain, which is something I've looked at in the past, of the value of something like the GGE or the open-ended working group on confidence building and on standard setting, because there always seem to erupt new issues of dissonance, even as the platform or the weapon system itself evolves and its operational realities change. And then, you question, is this not enough? Or if it's not working, what else to do, right? So in addition to the idea that you just talked about, which is of new platforms and new fora coming into the picture, there is also the question of what old fora have been able to achieve. And maybe we can unpack that in a future conversation. I know you have a lot on your mind when it comes to the GGE as well. But thank you so much again, Manoj, for taking us through everything, right from drones and autonomous weapons to Singapore and the strategy and what to expect of the ASEAN. Of course, that's something I'm going to communicate far and wide as much as possible, right? So thank you again for all of these insights. I hope our listeners had a lot to take away as well. And we'll be reading more of Manoj's work from the caption. So thank you also to our listeners for tuning into this episode of All Things Policy.
Thanks so much, Anushka.
If you liked our show, deep dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.